While the Nazis were burning records, deporting entire families, and erasing names from history, one woman, invisible to the regime, was doing the exact opposite. She was writing down names, burying small pieces of paper in glass jars beneath a random tree. What seemed like a meaningless gesture was in fact a secret operation that fooled the most feared army of the time. She was arrested, tortured, sentenced to death. But she never revealed what she knew, and to this day, soldiers who took thousands of lives fall silent when they hear what she hid, because what this woman did was as dangerous as a weapon and far more unforgettable. Before we begin, make sure to like this video if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Together, let's honor her memory. My name is Irina Sendler, but for a long time, that name was just a whisper. A name hidden in dark hallways, fake documents, and knowing glances. Because back then, a name could get you killed. Have you ever felt like the whole world lost its mind, like right and wrong flipped before your eyes, and no one seemed to care? That's exactly how I felt when Warsaw was swallowed by German tanks in 1939. The noise was deafening, but the worst part was the silence. The silence of neighbors, the silence of friends, the silence of the church. Silence, and was what terrified me the most. I was a social worker, just an ordinary woman like so many others. I studied, I worked, I cared for people, especially the poor, the sick, the forgotten. But suddenly, the forgotten had a name, and that name was Jew. Do you know how monstrosities begin? Not with blood, not with screams, but with warnings, laws, whispers. First they lost their jobs, then their schools, then their bank accounts. And before I knew it, they were fencing entire families behind walls of brick and shame. They called it the Warsaw Ghetto. But I knew what it really was. A cage. What hurt the most? Most people pretended not to see, or said, "It's just temporary." But I knew that smell, the stench of a lie, right before death. I couldn't take it anymore. Watching children rot behind fences while the world moved on. Have you ever looked into a mother's eyes? A mother who knows her child is going to die and there's nothing she can do. I have, many times. And that's what changed me. It was either that or stay silent. Either that or lose my mind. So I made a decision. If no one else would act, I would. Even if I had to do it alone. Even if it cost me my life. I entered the ghetto with a fake ID, used my position to claim I was preventing epidemics. It was a lie. I didn't bring medicine. I brought hope. The first time I smuggled a child out, my whole body shook. It was a baby, tiny. He didn't even have a name. The mother pleaded with her eyes. She pointed at him, then at me, then at the sky. That was all it took. I placed his fragile little body inside a toolbox. Yes, a toolbox. Pretended it was medical equipment. The soldier at the gate looked me dead in the eyes. I could feel sweat dripping down my back. If he asked me to open it, that would have been the end. But he didn't. And that baby I survived. That day I didn't just save a child, I saved myself from cowardice. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what came next. Because saving a life isn't just about getting someone out. It's hiding them, feeding them, giving them a new name. It's tearing them from their mother's arms and promising they'll be reunited, even when you know that maybe, just maybe, they never will. Could you do that? Take a child from her mother's embrace, knowing it might be the last time they ever see each other? I did, hundreds of times, and each time felt like tearing a piece of my soul away. But there was something even harder, keeping the secret, because I wrote down each child's real name and the false name they would use to survive. I hid those names inside glass jars, buried them beneath an apple tree in a friend's backyard. Why? Because someday, when all of it was over, I wanted to dig them up and bring those children back to their families. That hope, the dream of rebuilding what had been broken, is what gave me strength. But time was running out, And the Nazis were becoming more suspicious and more brutal. Every week, a new rumor, someone gone, someone executed. I slept in fear and woke up with even more. But I kept going, because I wasn't fighting for an ideology. I was fighting for humanity. And because there were tiny eyes and trembling hands waiting for me behind that wall. Have you ever tried to look calm while carrying death in your pockets? That's how I felt every time I walked out of the ghetto. Sweaty hands, shaky knees, a child hidden in blankets, in bags, even in an ambulance. Every step was a challenge to fate. But I wasn't alone anymore. The network grew. There were priests, midwives, drivers, nurses. Some forged documents. Others sheltered children in orphanages, farms, convents. None of them did it for glory. In fact, nobody wanted attention. Being noticed meant being questioned. And in Warsaw, a single question could mean death. Each week we came up with new ways to outsmart the Nazis. Children sedated, hidden in sacks of potatoes, babies wrapped in blankets, smuggled out as bodies bound for cremation. Some escaped through the sewers, guided by volunteers. Others walked out, disguised in tiny German soldier uniforms. Yes, we did that, and you would too if you'd seen what I saw. Because in the ghetto, time didn't pass. It rotted. People vanished overnight. Hunger drove people mad. Diseases devoured children in weeks, and always, that smell of endings. One day I stood before a little girl, maybe 4 years old. She had the darkest eyes I've ever seen, like deep wells. Her mother couldn't speak, just cried. The girl looked at me, held my hand and asked, "Will I go back home when this is over?" I froze. The truth? Maybe her home wouldn't even exist when it was over, but I couldn't say that, so I just said, "Yes, I promise." And that promise became my burden, carried in silence, buried, with those jars under the apple tree. You know what haunted me at night? Not the screams, not the gunshots. It was the sound of little voices whispering my name as I walked away, as if they were handing me their lives in that whisper. But the Germans weren't fools, they started to suspect. We were reported more than once, so we always had escape routes ready, passwords, signals, glances we had practiced. But nothing was foolproof, the tension was constant. Have you ever lived a single day knowing it might be your last, for weeks on end? I lived like that for years, and then, one day, it happened. My door was kicked in before sunrise. The Gestapo stormed in. No shouting. They didn't need to. The terror was already in the sound of their boots on the floor. They took me, charged me with conspiracy, sabotage, treason. They wanted the names. They wanted to know where the children were. They beat me, badly. They broke my bones, ripped out my nails, but I never spoke. Not out of heroism, but because if I talked, those children would die the next day. Simple as that. The pain I could take, but the thought of betraying those mothers, of giving up those little ones, that I could never forgive. I spent months in prison, waiting for execution. Every morning they'd call my name and I'd think, this is it. But it wasn't. Not yet. And then one day, they released me. Just like that. No explanation. Later I learned the resistance had bribed a guard, paid everything they had to set me free. And do you know what I did after I got out? I went back underground, back to burying names, back to saving children. Because I still had promises to keep, because those children were still waiting for me, and because I still had hands, and as long as I had hands, I would use them to hold someone else's life. Have you ever held someone's life in your hands, knowing that the tiniest slip could mean their death? I have. That's what it felt like with every name I buried, every piece of paper soaked in a mother's tears, or in my own blood. And the more names I buried, the clearer it became. This was a countdown, a ticking time bomb made of names and lives, and I was alone in the dark, trying to defuse it. I remember a boy named Adam. He was 6, but spoke like he was 40. He knew he was being taken. He knew his mother wasn't coming. Before he left, she held him so tightly it nearly broke all of us. But it was what she said that tore me apart. Promise me he'll remember me. I promised. Even knowing that memory often fades when it becomes a shield, even knowing that to survive he might have to forget. And that's what broke me so many times. I wasn't just saving lives, I was erasing stories, religions, names. I was creating ghosts, children who would have to relearn how to exist under new identities, boys who went to sleep as Moish and woke up as Marek, girls who prayed in Hebrew and learned to pray in Latin. And all of that, for what? So that maybe, one day, if everything went right, they could have a chance to live like anyone else. But you know what almost never happened? That everything going right. Because when the war ended, almost no one came back. The mothers, dead. The fathers, gone. The homes, burned. The neighborhoods, erased. The last names, wiped out forever. And those children, saved at such high cost, became orphans of the past, survivors without roots. But during the war, all I could think about was the next rescue, and the risks, because after prison I became an even bigger target. The Germans knew me. They knew who I was, and they knew I hadn't stopped. I hid in basements, slipped through alleys, changed identities like changing clothes. And still, I didn't stop. There was an urgency inside me that left no room for fear, a cold urgency. No heroism, no hope, just duty, a burden, a child crying inside the ghetto, a mother pleading with her eyes. She had a piece of paper in the bottom of my pocket. That was all it took to keep going. Until one day, and I began to ask dangerous questions. How many lives was I saving? And how many was I sacrificing in the process? How many mothers died in despair because I took their children and they never knew where? How many children were given to families that later turned out to be cruel? How many never trusted anyone again? I lost sleep over that, because saving a life isn't the same as saving a soul. Sometimes the soul dies even when the body survives, and that's when I understood. War doesn't just destroy buildings, it destroys connections, it silences stories, it rips identity out by the root. But even then, I kept going. Not because I believed it was right, but because there was no one else to do it. It was either that, or accept the silence. And silence, in those days, was the worst sin of all. Have you ever felt like the world had stopped just to watch you die? That's exactly how it felt the day they caught me again. Yes, I had been arrested before, tortured, interrogated, but this was different. This time they knew who I was. They knew how many children. They knew I hadn't stopped. They knew I was digging holes in the heart of the Third Reich. They took me to the Gestapo headquarters like someone being lowered into a grave. The cuffs cut into my wrists. The cold stone floor mocked my weakness, and the soldiers' eyes, there were holes, bottomless pits. This time there were no questions, no screaming. They knew I wouldn't talk. So they threw me into a cell, alone, no windows, no voice. And the next day, they led me to the yard. The ground was covered in dirty snow, and in the middle of the yard, an open grave. That was it. That was the end. Have you ever seen your own grave while you were still alive? I saw it. They didn't just want to kill me. They wanted to erase my name, make me disappear. No trace, no martyr, no headline. They pushed me toward the grave. My body ached, my legs trembled. But what hurt the most was knowing the jars were still there, buried, hidden. And if I died, no one else would know where. Names lost, lives erased. So when the gun was raised at me, I thought, it's over. They've won. But at the last moment, a voice whispered something in German. One guard hesitated. Another appeared. There was a glance, silence, and then gunshots, but not at me. The Germans dropped. Their blood stained the snow. I stood frozen, my body trembling, my mind in shock. It was the resistance. They had found out where I was and planned everything. They wore the uniforms, bribed an officer, and pulled me out and like a living corpse. And in a way, That's exactly what I was. They hid me in a house in the countryside. I lay there for days, burning with fever, not recognizing faces. I had nightmares and of the grave, of the names, of children whispering my name in the dark. But when my strength returned, I went back. Back to the records, back to the jars, back to the little ones, because as long as they were alive, I had no right to stop. That grave they dug for me, it became a symbol, a warning. I was already dead to the regime, and the dead have no fear. From that point on, I became someone else, colder, faster, more relentless. Now it wasn't just about saving, it was about resisting, about making sure that when the war ended, someone would still be here to tell what happened, and that someone had to be me. Have you ever waited so long for something that when it finally happens, it feels like a lie? That's how it felt the day the war ended. Warsaw was in ruins. What once had been a living city, full of music, the smell of fresh bread, voices in the streets, was now an open graveyard, homes destroyed, debris everywhere, people walking like ghosts, hollow-eyed with no idea where to go. And me, standing there, knees still muddy, digging up names, jar by jar. Can you imagine what that's like? Digging up little pieces of paper, dirty, faded, handwritten, each one holding a thin thread of hope. That was the hardest part. Not the rescuing, not the hiding, but the remembering. Remembering who was who they belonged to, where they were now. Because many of those children already had new names, new lives. Some didn't even know they'd been saved. They'd grown up in convents, on farms, in orphanages. They had learned to call other people mom and dad. And now I, a stranger, showed up saying, "You're someone else." Have you ever looked into a child's eyes and seen that they'd rather not remember? I have. And it wasn't their fault. It was self-protection, it was survival. But for me, each name was a thread of dignity I had to restore, even if it hurt, even if it was too late, because many families no longer existed. I once tried to return a girl to her mother. I found out the mother had died 2 days before the liberation. She had survived the ghetto, survived deportation, but not the return. Her heart gave out. The girl cried without knowing why. She no longer remembered her mother's face, but she cried anyway, as if her body knew before her mind did. And there were more stories like that. Fathers who returned and didn't recognize their children. Children who refused to leave their adoptive families. People who simply didn't want to touch the past anymore. And who could blame them? The war didn't just kill people, it broke bonds. It taught survivors to forget, to stop feeling, to keep moving forward. As if erasing footprints in the snow, but I couldn't forget, because every name I unearthed was a promise I had made on my knees. Promises whispered, in tears, in silence. And those promises were the only part of me still intact. Do you know what's most cruel? That when it was all over, no one asked me to tell the story. No one came to ask how it happened. No one wanted to know the names, or the risks, or the open grave, or the glass jars. People wanted to move on, rebuild, turn the page, and I was left behind, with the story in my hands, alone. It was in that silence that I understood. Sometimes the greatest things you do, no one will ever see, but still, they need to be done. Because in the end, what keeps us human is not what others recognize. It's what we choose not to abandon, even when the whole world already has. When the war ended, many waved flags. They celebrated. They marched through the streets as if the nightmare had been buried along with the rubble. But we, those of us who had been in the basements, the dark corridors, the ghettos, the convents, we didn't wave flags. We just breathed, with difficulty, like someone who surfaces after being underwater for too long, like someone who forgot what it's like to live, without hiding. The newspapers didn't talk about us, the radios didn't mention our names, and I went back to work as a social worker, in the same office, in the same city, but in a country that pretended not to remember. Do you know what it's like to become a shadow of your own story? Poland changed. And with it, the priorities changed too. New regimes came, new oppressions, new persecutions, and those who had risked everything to save lives began to be seen with suspicion. Yes, I was watched. I was removed from public positions. My name was erased from official records. Why? Because I no longer served any political purpose. Because I was inconvenient. Because my story didn't fit into slogans. And then, once again, silence. The same silence from before the war. The same silence that had once forced me to act. The same silence I knew so well, and now dressed in new clothes. I kept the jars for a few more years. And slowly, I began handing over the remaining names to Jewish organizations. Institutions started helping me. But even so, each handoff felt like a funeral, because the faces were gone. Because for many, that slip of paper was all that remained of their identity. And then comes the inevitable question. The question I still carry today. Was it worth it? Do you think it's worth saving a life, even if that life grows up carrying the very trauma you helped cause? Do you think it's worth protecting someone, knowing it will condemn them to a life caught between two identities, two worlds, two pains? I thought about that for years, and every time a child looked at me with confusion, or an adult wrote to me saying, "Thank you, but I don't remember you," I wondered, did I do the right thing? But then, one day, I received a letter. It came from far away. It was from a young woman who had been rescued as a baby. She wrote, "My name is no longer what it was. I don't know the smell of my mother. I don't know the language she spoke. But I know that because of you, I had a birthday. I had love, I had a child, and now he lives too. You didn't save a life, you saved a generation." I cried. I didn't cry during the war. I didn't cry when they beat me. I didn't cry when they threw me into that grave. But I cried then, alone, with that letter in my hands, because for the first time I understood something simple and brutal. You never save an entire life. You save a moment when that life could have ended, and didn't. And sometimes, that's all we have to give. But sometimes, it's everything. The years went by. The jars dissolved with time. The papers turned to dust. The names, they still live, scattered across countries, accents and surnames that never knew their origins. And me? I was forgotten. For decades, my story remained buried like an unsigned document, under layers of politics, shame, and rebuilding. After all, who wants to remember there was a time when babies had to be hidden in toolboxes to survive? But memory isn't something you bury. It insists. It burns. And then, many years later, when I was old, nearly invisible, they found me. Some people started researching, connecting the dots, asking the questions no one had asked before, and suddenly, my name reappeared. First in articles, then in documentaries, then in ceremonies. There were medals, honors, awards. Too late for many answers, but not too late for the gestures. I remember once being invited to a school. Children waited for me with flowers. One of them, eyes shining, asked, "Are you the lady who saved the babies from the ghetto?" I took a deep breath, and I answered, "No, I was just the one who didn't close her eyes, because that's what it is. There's no heroism here, no miracles. There are choices, made one by one, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of anger, but always with the certainty that the worst crime is doing nothing." Today, when I look back, I don't think about the medals, or the news articles, or the well-written speeches at ceremonies. I think of Adam. I think of the girl with the dark eyes. I think of the mother's hands giving me their children like they were handing over their own hearts. And I think that, had I stayed silent, no one else would have spoken for them. You know, people sometimes ask me, "How did you find the courage to do what you did?" But that's the wrong question. The right question is, why did so many others do nothing? Helping doesn't require courage, it requires conscience. And sometimes that's enough, because history doesn't stand on monuments, it stands on gestures. Small ones, anonymous, made in the dark, while the rest of the world slept. And if today those children live, if their children live, It's because one day someone was afraid but chose to act anyway. And that's what matters.